This is Hungary calling, the last remaining station. Early this morning, the Soviet troops launched a general attack on Hungary. We are requesting you to send us immediate aid in the form of parachute troops for the sake of God and freedom. Help Hungary.
It began as nothing more than a student demonstration. Thousands of young people and those who were sympathetic to their cause marching through the streets of their country's major city to reach the hub of government. A breaking point finally having been reached from those who sought to break free from the shackles of a Soviet Union-imposed government that had been at the seat of power since Russians drove Nazi Germany out of that country at the end of World War II. It was a revolt by people seeking to be free, those who refused to knuckle under to the oppressive dictatorship of the hammer and sickle, and would help change the face of Eastern Europe, beginning in October of 1956. The nation of Hungary celebrates their freedom after 60 years with new challenges, new ideas, and a Europe that is once again facing drastic change that reaches across borders and threatens their way of life and that of neighboring nations. As a descendant of a proud Hungarian family, it is my pleasure to welcome the Hungarian Ambassador to the United States, economist, political scientist, and politician, Reka Szamerkenyi. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
It is our pleasure. Ambassador, 60 years on since that date, that brutal end to the Hungarian Revolution as well. Why is it crucial, not just for Hungarians around the world, but for the world itself, to recognize the significance of this revolution and this anniversary?
What has been very clear, I think, in the past year's research on the impact of 1956 was that it was not only the first massive demonstration against the oppression of the Soviet Union, but also it was the first real expression of the love for freedom and democracy of the nations of the then so-called satellite states of the Soviet Union. And as such, it did have a powerful impact on the course of the Cold War in general. That is why I believe it is very important to focus and refocus on the message of 1956. What happened back then was that a generation that was put under a massive oppression stood up for freedom and democracy, very much inspired by the values of the United States and the free world at the time, and gave inspiration and hope for the entire region. What happened in 1956 had a powerful impact for the 1968 generation of the Czechoslovakia of the time, of the 1980 generation of Poland, and led in the end to the end of the Cold War in 1989, leading to the first free elections in 1990, and then the withdrawal of the Soviet troops in 1991. And what we get as a fundamental message is that when we were reconfirming our sovereignty in 1990, it was really on the values and the message and the moral of the 1956 revolution.
History always has a way of making us sometimes forget. The years go by and we see black and white film, and generations often sometimes seek to look past what actually happened. If you could, give us a sense of the history then of that time, because it wasn't that long after World War II, the brutal manner in which Hungary had been decimated and its people kept down for so many years in the fog of war, watching as the world changed around us. But can you give us a sense of what it was like to live in that time and to be there, that forced the people of Hungary at that time to say enough is enough?
It was a most heroic and most elevating moment of Hungarian and, I believe, Central European history. It was a moment when really a generation could stood up and could join their efforts and express their beliefs in their values. It was a moment that really showed that the values are the leading force of Central Europe. And that is really the fundamental link, I believe, with the Western European and Western free world peoples with the Central European peoples of the time who were put under this heavy oppression.
What does history then teach us about what life was like? And I ask that because here at this stage of the 21st century, I believe there are so many people, generations, that don't understand, can't understand what it was like to live under the yoke of Soviet oppression.
I find this very powerful. I teach at universities and give lectures, and I can see that the generations of today's universities have very little understanding and happily so of the depression and the difficulties of the time. But it was really incredibly strong and going into the details of every individual's lives as well. Not only was free expression of political opinions impossible or free practice of religion impossible, but also for those who stood up by their values, the repercussions went not just for the individual, but for the entire family and the entire nation, really. What happened was, I believe, was a massive effort to oppress every possibility of expressing opinion, beliefs, values that were opposed to the Soviet regime.
When we discuss what happened, and you just said the Soviet regime, we look back at that time and understand how brutal the Soviets were at that time, how brutal Nikita Khrushchev and others were when it came to keeping the Hungarian people down. And we look at today, as a matter of fact, where we see a Russia that we once thought was going to be free and was going to be much more amenable to civil rights and human rights, that now even seems to this day to be reverting back to that time back in the 50s, that oppressive nature. It never really seems to go away to the people of Hungary, does it? They may think that the rest of the world might have seen Russia become a different nation, but then we think back, it's just as it was back then. It's almost as if history is repeating itself in so many ways.
I think this is why it is very important to think back of the values and the message of 1956, so that history will not repeat itself. I very much believe that the lessons we learned from that era and from those really 13 glorious days of freedom for the Hungarians of the time was that the values and the beliefs in democracy and in freedom are the ones that can lead a whole nation and can unite a whole nation. And if nations stand up by their values, the outcome will have to be positive. It may not come right away. It may take generations to come, but the power of the values and of the values of freedom and democracy in particular are the ones that can change the world. This is why I very much believe that 1956 was a freedom fight that changed the entire global history of the Cold War.
I think we also have to look at what happened after that as well. An estimated 2,500 Hungarians died. 200,000 more fled as refugees. Many were arrested. 26,000 were brought before the Hungarian courts. 22,000 were sentenced. 13,000 imprisoned. Several hundred executed. Hundreds deported to the Soviet Union, many without any evidence whatsoever, never to be heard from again. When we look at these numbers, it is staggering to consider the people in this generation to think that anything like that could ever happen. If you could give us a sense of those numbers and the years after this revolution, the scar that it left on Hungary, the families that were ripped apart by no fault of their own whatsoever, and what it did to help forge and fashion the Hungary that exists today.
I think there is no family that was untouched by the revolution of 1956. There is no family that wouldn't have their stories of how their parents or grandparents were fighting with the revolutionaries, were trying to support the fighters. It was a nationwide effort. It was amazing that people in Budapest were the ones to start the demonstrations, but it spread in the entire country. And when, after the first few days, the Soviet tanks' withdrawal, but still, the shops and everything was still under the shock of the first battles and the first fights against the Soviet tanks. The entire country got their act together, and for instance, people in the countryside were sending food on trains to the capital, to the people who were actually fighting before, so that they will not be starving. In many other cities in Hungary, the freedom fight took the same shape. There were many examples, unfortunately, of the Hungarian KGB shooting at the crowds in other cities as well, killing many people and wounding hundreds. And I think this is a very powerful example of how the ideals can impact an entire country and can spread, how fast they can spread through the understanding and the common beliefs of the nation.
When people speak about World War II, we often immediately think about the Holocaust, where people of the world always say to themselves, never forget, as the important phrase. Is it not fair to say that we need to also consider those words for what happened in Hungary in 1956. The world needs to never forget, because it was at the time one nation. But what happened there certainly affected Eastern Europe, America as well, and so many others around the globe. We can never forget what happened, especially because of the human cost.
Absolutely, and I think what is very powerful and very clear for the entire international environment of the time was that the Soviet pressure seemed predominant, seemed totally impossible to fight. Yet the beliefs of the people were strong enough to stand up to them and actually be victorious for some time. And I very much believe that the fact that after the revolution was put down and the Soviet tanks came back in massive numbers and really destroyed the city of Budapest very badly, so much so that after the 1956 revolution, the damage on Budapest was, to many historians, practically equaling the damage of the Second World War. So I think it is the military aspect was very powerful as well. Yet, what I think is very important is that this message of the 56ers was the one that continued to be there under the surface, to shape generations. And I can tell you that was the real standard for Hungarians, and I believe many people in the Central European countries as well, to set their targets for. I also was brought up on the values of 1956. We were always discussing the stories of what happened. We have our own family stories of 1956 that shaped my decisions, my political values and ideals, and that shaped the generation that I was growing up with, also to follow up on the footsteps of the 1956ers.
When you talk about the values of 1956, do you get a sense that young Hungarians today, those who are in their teens, those students, those 20s and 30-somethings, do they get it? Do they understand it? Do they know what those values are and how they need to relate to them?
A large part of the society does get it. And I believe, as it was the case in many of the families that I know of, that the message and the stories of 1956 kept on alive in every family discussion. But of course, there is a massive number of people who are coming up who may have no personal recollection, and that is why it is our responsibility to bring it back to the fore, to discuss the message and the developments and the events of 1956, to be able to go back to these people everywhere in the country, to underline the message and make sure that the values live on.
Is it not fair to say that not only Hungarians celebrate at this point, but Eastern Europe needs to celebrate? Members of the EU today need to celebrate what Hungary did. Americans need to celebrate it simply because of the way it did indeed. That revolution, that effort changed the world.
On one hand, we really have to honor the bravery and the courage and the beliefs and the power of the heroes of 1956, those Budapest lads, as we call them, who were taking, up the fight and throwing Molotov cocktails at the Soviet tanks and fighting with bare arms against the Soviet oppression. But at the same time of honoring them, we would really also like to honor those, especially here in the United States, American decision makers and everyday ordinary people as well, who were keeping their fingers crossed, who had their hearts go out for the Hungarians, who supported the values of the revolution, and who, after the crushing of the revolution, opened their country to welcoming those Hungarians who had to flee from the communist oppression of Hungary at the time.
Hungary was fighting for its culture in 1956, fighting for its people. Is it not fair to say, let's bring this forward to the 21st century now? Hungary right now is also fighting for its culture, fighting for its people, fighting for its security. When you look at what is happening with the anti-refugee legislation, with the European Union, with the fact that Hungary itself is trying desperately to keep its country stable when they are being forced in many ways to take in and allow refugees to flow through the country, when it has that factor of perhaps changing the country forever, and it is once again an assault for the nation.
What is happening in Europe, and I think what is happening in Hungary in particular, is a powerful expression of the external pressures impacting on the stability and security of a society. It cannot be expected for any country to open up and without any registration, any vetting, any consideration, allow hundreds of thousands of illegal migrants walk through the country and do whatever they like. What I very much believe is that we all have the responsibility of the 1956ers to live up to the standards and the values of freedom and democracy, but that only can happen if we do have the security of the country as well. That, I think, is a link that ties us to the United States as well, very strongly. What I can see is that the freedom and democracy that all our societies want for themselves has to be secured. We have the responsibility to live up to this expectation of our peoples. And if we cannot provide the security for our nations, then I think we're losing something. It is a historic responsibility because the migration levels and the numbers are incredible. These are just the 2015, for instance, we had almost 400,000 illegal migrants entering and going through Hungary. If we compare this with the population of the United States, that means as if the United States had, within 12 months, 12 million illegal entrants into the country. I think with these numbers, you can understand the pressures and you can understand how important it is for us to keep our security and independence and sovereignty that we regained just in 1990.
The word has to go out. It is not that the Hungarian people and Hungary wants to be evil in any sense, to push people out, but it is simply a matter of survival. Do not tell the Hungarian people what you must do, what you have to do. You must leave it to the people themselves and the government in order to look at what's happening in the country, and that's the problem here with the European Union, what Brussels is far too often almost forcing down the throat of the Hungarians. They are just not looking at it from the Hungarian point of view. And doesn't it have to be, in any sense of the imagination, it's got to be about your country and your people first?
I very much believe we are sharing this concern for the future of our country and the future of our civilization. And I very much believe that this is exactly what is the biggest stake of our times. What we have seen is that the open up and welcome everyone without registration, without any concern for security, cannot be upheld for a long time. I believe this is a serious problem that the United States has seen. It is a problem that the United Nations will have to tackle. I think it is absolutely clear that not one country can respond to this, but Hungary, which has been in the first front line, really, of this migration wave, has a responsibility to stand up and warn everybody else that the security of our country and the security of our culture and nation for every decision maker in every country has to come first. But I think the understanding that without security there can be no peaceful life and no stability, no economic development is very clear. We have proven very clearly on several instances that when people need real refuge and real support for their lives, we were welcoming every single refugee from the war of the Balkans in the early 90s. And they stayed in the territory of Hungary as long as they needed it, and then they went back home and we supported them. Some stayed, some went back home. But I believe the current migration wave is very different from that one. And the understanding of this difference is strategically important. If we mess up everything and we don't understand what's the difference between a refugee and a migrant, what's the difference between a migrant and an illegal migrant, then I think our societies are in real trouble. So it is our responsibility as Hungarians and as a people conscious of its values and its love of freedom and democracy to stand up and warn the other countries as well that we have to get our act together and we have to start to think about common solution for these problems.
Is that the point we need to make here, is that Hungary is standing right now at the forefront, is basically the model at this point, and needs to be seen as the country that is telling people Europe is important, our cultures are important, our people are important. We must put that first and foremost and make sure that we create that Europe, if you will, that still is worthy of all people being able to keep their culture and make sure that it never goes away.
Absolutely, and I very much can sense that coming together in many parts of Europe. At the beginning, a lot of the steps and decisions of the Hungarian government were criticized, but over the course of the past year, many other European nations understood the threats and the challenges, and they are now forming common positions, and they are starting to develop common policies. I believe the pressures are huge. We have to react, and we have to understand that the first year of 2015, allowing 1.5 million illegal migrants into the European Union territory is just the first year. It's not the end of the process. The migration wave continues. The illegal aspect has not been tackled at all by the European Union decision makers. We have not been able to come to closer to a common solution on the European level, although you can see this forging consensus and this strengthened cooperation in the Central European part of the continent. So I very much hope that this year, 2016, will really have to push us to start to think seriously about common policies.
My grandfather would be proud of his home. I certainly am as well. Hungarian Ambassador Reka Szamerkenyi, thank you for allowing us this opportunity to learn more about your nation and the continued fight to remain a free and a meaningful country.
Thank you so much for the possibility.